The turning points in modern wars don't always come with speeches, breaking news banners, or official declarations. Sometimes history changes in the quiet hum of radar screens, in the curve of a flight path, in a flurry of emergency calls bouncing between capitals. This story starts with one of those moments. On this night, Russia didn't just fire another missile at Ukraine. It staged a performance. A long-range cruise missile sliced across western Ukraine, flying a route so deliberate, so surgically plotted, that NATO's early warning systems across Eastern Europe lit up almost in unison. Polish sensors picked up the shockwave. Lithuanian and Romanian radars watched the object skim uncomfortably close to Alliance airspace for several long minutes. No one inside those command centers could say with absolute confidence whether the missile had crossed the invisible line that could have rewritten global history. This wasn't a random shot. It was choreography. The most important thing about this strike wasn't what blew up on the ground. It was how Russia chose to deliver the message. The missile was sent on a path designed to be noticed, to force NATO to track it, to compel Washington to react, and to drag the war in Ukraine back into the center of the global stage. In operations rooms from Brussels to Washington, hotlines came alive. Officers compared radar tracks, checked satellite imagery, matched timelines down to the second. And once the numbers were checked and rechecked, one conclusion cut through the noise. Moscow knew exactly what it was doing. This wasn't a battlefield whim. It was a calculated signal. Senior U.S. officials, speaking with a seriousness missing for months, used a phrase they had carefully avoided until now. This strike constituted a direct threat. Two words, but in diplomatic language, they're seismic. They don't just describe risk. They shift red lines. Once that label was attached, everything else had to move with it. Because when something becomes a direct threat, it's no longer distant, abstract, or optional. It becomes immediate, personal, and it demands an answer. This was the night the war walked up to NATO's doorstep and rang the bell. To understand why Washington snapped to attention so quickly, you have to ignore the blast crater and look instead at two things: the target Russia picked and the map it chose to play with. The missile didn't hit a trench, a frontline position, or a tank column. It struck a logistics hub in western Ukraine, far from the grinding battles in the east. This facility wasn't where the fighting happened. It was where the fighting was sustained, a key node in the flow of Western weapons, ammunition, and equipment streaming in from Europe. This wasn't an attempt to seize ground. It was an attempt to choke a bloodstream. By going after that lifeline so close to NATO territory, Russia sent a layered message: Ukraine's supply chain can be touched, and NATO's closeness can be turned into a pressure point. Inside the White House, that nuance mattered. Briefing after briefing landed on the same point. Russia was no longer simply reacting on the battlefield. It was shaping the psychological terrain. The cruise missile was built for precision, but the operation itself was engineered for intimidation. And there was another detail that raised every eyebrow in the room. This was the first time Russia had used this particular class of long-range cruise missile in western Ukraine. These are not mass-produced throwaway weapons. They're costly, limited, and harder to replace under sanctions. The Kremlin does not burn through them without purpose. So why spend such a high-value weapon on a target with modest tactical payoff? The answer pointed back to NATO. By forcing alliance radars to lock on a Russian missile tracking right along the edge of NATO airspace, Moscow forced generals and politicians to stare down the worst-case scenario: a stray turn, a malfunction, or a miscalculation that sends a warhead into Polish skies. Russia wasn't just attacking Ukraine. It was asking the West a question: how close can we come before you blink? That's why American officials dropped the usual careful wording. They called it intentional. They called it a test. And in Kiev, President Zelensky understood those implications instantly. His response wasn't loud for show. It was loud by design. He framed Ukraine as the barrier between Russia and the rest of Europe, the line holding the chaos back. Let this kind of behavior slide, he warned, and you're not preventing escalation, you're postponing it. This fight was no longer only about Ukrainian sovereignty. It was about whether the rules that have kept Europe from sliding into a wider war still exist in practice, or only on paper. Once that framing took hold in Washington, the discussion flipped. The question was no longer, should we respond? It became, how far are we willing to go? For nearly 2 years, U.S. policy had been a balancing act on a knife's edge. Yes, arm Ukraine, fund Ukraine, train Ukraine, but limit the range of certain weapons, restrict how and where Western systems could be used, whisper quiet warnings to Kiev about targets inside Russia. The entire strategy rested on one assumption: that Moscow, too, would avoid pushing certain lines. This missile flight shattered that illusion. At the Pentagon, the mood turned heavy. Experts who had spent their careers parsing Russian doctrine agreed on one unsettling point: the route that missile took wasn't the shortest or the easiest. It was the most visible. NATO's radars were supposed to see it. Command centers were meant to wrestle with its trajectory. The Kremlin wanted decision makers in the West to feel exactly how close things had come to disaster. High-resolution satellite imagery drove it home. A small shift in the missile's final turn, a fault in guidance, a gust of wind, a software glitch, and it would have crossed into Polish airspace. The conclusion from Western intelligence was blunt: Russia was no longer just leaning on Ukraine. It was testing the entire security system built around Europe since the Cold War. Washington didn't sit on that information. Calls went out to London, Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, Brussels, fast. Cables were stamped urgent. Publicly, the Secretary of State offered a condemnation that broke from earlier, more restrained language. Privately, something more important was happening. Options that had been politically radioactive a few weeks earlier were suddenly placed on the table. First, speed up the delivery of long-range weapons to Ukraine. Systems once delayed over escalation concerns were reconsidered. If Moscow was comfortable flying missiles a hair's breadth from NATO borders, the argument went, then Kyiv needed the ability to respond at distance, not just absorb punishment. Second, revisit the taboo on Ukrainian strikes inside Russia using Western-supplied weapons. For months, that had been treated as a hard stop. Now, senior voices were asking, if Russia can launch from sanctuary, why is Ukraine expected to fight with one arm tied behind its back? Third, reinforce NATO's eastern flank with a denser defensive shield. More air defenses, more modern radars, quicker to move units stationed within minutes of potential impact zones. The specifics mattered, but the real story was this: Russia's gambit didn't freeze the West. It unfroze it. Restraint was no longer seen purely as prudence. It was starting to look like an invitation. While Washington calculated, Kyiv acted. There was no illusion in Ukraine's capital about what had just happened. This strike near NATO's border wasn't just a military move. It was a psychological shock designed to stall decisions and sow hesitation. Ukraine refused to stall. Within hours, President Zelensky assembled his war cabinet, top generals, intelligence chiefs, key ministers. They understood perfectly that moments like this are brief windows. You either seize them or they close. Western regions, long treated as comparatively safer, were instantly bumped to the top of the priority list. Radar coverage was thickened. Mobile air defense units were moved and remapped. Contingency plans, the kind that sit in sealed folders until something breaks, were activated in anticipation of another long-range strike or a coordinated follow-up designed to overwhelm defenses. Technicians worked through the night, tuning counter-drone systems to deal with the now familiar specter of Iranian-made shade drones so often come in behind missile waves. Kyiv had seen this pattern before. Russia escalates. Russia waits. Russia probes the reaction. This time, Ukraine set out to break that rhythm. On the diplomatic front, Ukraine's foreign minister stepped out quickly. The tone was measured but sharp. No shouting, no theatrics, just a clear warning: if Russia can hurl missiles right up against NATO's borders and get away with it, escalation stops being a risk, it becomes a schedule. But words were only the opening move. By dawn, Kyiv had already delivered its reply, where Moscow listens most closely: on the battlefield. Coordinated Ukrainian strikes began hitting Russian-occupied territories with surgical precision. Intelligence teams had been quietly mapping out ammunition depots, drone assembly lines, command posts, targets that mattered but had been on hold, waiting for the right triggering moment. The moment had arrived. HIMARS batteries roared to life. Long-range drones took off. Modified platforms reached deeper into occupied zones than usual. The effect was immediate and visible. In Luhansk and Donetsk, massive secondary detonations lit up the sky as ammo depots cooked off for hours. In Zaporizhia, a drone production site was left in ruins. In Crimea, a forward base coordinating attacks was hit so accurately that even Russian state media struggled to spin it away. Russian military bloggers, normally loud, mocking, dismissive, suddenly sounded rattled. They wrote of confusion, shattered supply lines, local commanders scrambling. One acknowledged that official statements were understating the true scale of the losses. Another warned that Ukraine was no longer just hitting front lines, but the nervous system behind them. Inside Russia, the mood shifted. Not open chaos, but cracks. Families wanted answers. TV pundits tried on new narratives that didn't quite fit. The Kremlin, for once, offered almost nothing in terms of clarity. Ukraine's message was straightforward. If Russia thought intimidation would buy Ukrainian restraint, it had badly miscalculated. Escalation wouldn't freeze Ukraine. It would focus it. And that is where Moscow's strategy began to show its weak points. Russian planners had gambled on time. They expected hesitation, days of cautious statements, slow internal debates in Western capitals, careful phrasing designed to avoid provocation. Instead, they were hit with speed. Kyiv moved fast on the battlefield. Washington adjusted fast in its language. NATO coordinated fast in its planning. Intercepted communications, later reviewed by Western intelligence, captured the mood inside the Russian military machine. Senior officers were frustrated by how quickly events were moving. One complained that operations were unfolding faster than the chain of command could adapt. Another noted bitterly that the West had locked in its response before Moscow had time to shape the political story. That detail matters because for much of this war, the Kremlin has relied on controlling the narrative almost as much as firing weapons. Delay means leverage. Confusion means room to maneuver. This time, Moscow got neither. In front of the cameras, Russian officials reverted to their usual mix: deny, deflect, blame. They hinted the missiles route had been misunderstood, or that Ukrainian air defenses were responsible, or that the West was exaggerating. But the messaging wobbled. State TV struggled to keep a consistent line. Talking points changed mid-show. Hosts contradicted one another. Viewers noticed the seams. Online, even in tightly moderated forums, uncomfortable questions bubbled up. Loyal audiences sensed a gap between the confident tone and the reality of what was unfolding. Unusual NATO unity, accelerated weapon shipments, and Russian infrastructure taking heavy hits. Silence at the very top only deepened that sense of unease. Meanwhile, Western intelligence painted an even darker picture for Moscow. Russia's supply of high-precision missiles was running low. Months of attacks had eaten into stockpiles that sanctions made painfully hard to replenish. The missile used in this near-NATO strike belonged to a shrinking elite inventory, each unit worth millions, dependent on components Russia increasingly struggles to import. So again, the question, why burn such a rare asset on a target with limited direct battlefield payoff? Analysts in Washington and European capitals converged on a stark judgment. This wasn't a sign of endless confidence. It was a sign of pressure, a regime straining to project strength and revealing its vulnerabilities in the process. Putin ordered Russian forces onto heightened alert, a phrase meant to suggest readiness and resolve. But intelligence insiders saw more theater than substance. Logistics were stretched thin. Troops were tired. Equipment shortages were increasingly impossible to hide. For the first time in weeks, something new crept into the Kremlin's inner circle: doubt. And as that doubt grew, the center of gravity shifted westward to Brussels. The emergency NATO session that followed was not another routine gathering with scripted talking points and pre-agreed communiques. From the moment delegations arrived, you could feel the difference. Armored vehicles outside, thick security, military advisors hovering close, reading off the latest intelligence updates as they arrived. Everyone in that room understood this meeting wasn't just about Ukraine, it was about the credibility of the alliance itself. The Secretary General opened with a blunt assessment. Russia hadn't just pushed a boundary on a map, it had challenged a principle. If this kind of behavior went unchallenged, it would normalize a level of risk that Europe had spent decades trying to drive down. Debate followed, but not the kind of fragmentation Moscow had been counting on. Yes, different nations had different comfort zones. Yes, domestic politics still mattered. But beneath it all, a shared conclusion took shape. Holding back in the face of this escalation would not keep the peace. It would invite the next test. By the time the session wound down, NATO had settled on a coordinated response package measured, but impossible to mistake. First, air defense. Eastern flank countries asked for immediate reinforcements, and they got them. More Patriot batteries, expanded F-35 patrols, advanced counter-drone systems. The subtext was simple. NATO airspace would no longer be something Russia could brush against without expecting a reaction. Second, surveillance, alliance reconnaissance assets, planes, drones, radar platforms would fly closer to Russian borders, tracking missile activity almost in real time. This wasn't escalation for its own sake. It was about stripping away ambiguity. No more time wasting guesses about what had just been launched and from where. Third, Ukraine's capabilities. Weapons that had been slow-rolled for political reasons were moved into the fast lane. Long-range systems, extra air defense equipment, and precision strike tools were approved for accelerated delivery. European supply routes were synchronized, so this wasn't just a press release. It was a logistical reality. Fourth, economic pressure. Sanctions were tightened, not in broad, symbolic strokes, but with a scalpel. The focus, Russia's military-industrial base, missile plants, electronic component pipelines, foreign middlemen quietly helping Moscow bypass restrictions. This time, NATO coordinated much more closely with partners outside Europe to close the loopholes Russia had been slipping through. From Washington came an additional push. U.S. diplomats argued that half measures would only delay, not prevent the next crisis. If Russia believed the alliance was tired or divided, that illusion had to be broken now, clearly and publicly. Behind closed doors, Zelensky pressed his case directly. Ukraine wasn't asking for Western boots on the ground, he reminded everyone. It was asking for the tools to prevent the war from jumping the fence into NATO territory. That argument, long seen as emotionally powerful but strategically risky, now felt different. After watching a Russian missile skate along their borders, European leaders heard it with fresh ears. Quietly, a shift took place. Officials who had once warned that giving Ukraine too much range could be destabilizing started to acknowledge an uncomfortable reality. Deterrence doesn't come from self-imposed limits, it comes from credible capability. By the time the summit wrapped up, one fact was unavoidable. Russia hadn't managed to split NATO, it had solidified it. The strategic environment Moscow believed it could manipulate was slipping out of its hands. As the last late-night calls ended and the final secure cables were sent, the real impact of Russia's decision became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a turning point measured in buildings destroyed or casualties recorded. It was measured in momentum. Russia had tried to intimidate. Instead, it clarified by flying a missile dangerously close to NATO. Moscow forced the West to ask itself what kind of risk it was willing to live with. The answer this time came faster than the Kremlin expected. Ukraine hit back not with desperation, but with precision. Washington dropped its cautious tone and called the strike what it was, a direct threat. NATO didn't fracture under pressure. It snapped into alignment. The story the Kremlin had been telling itself, that the West was divided, exhausted, and paralyzed by fear of escalation, crashed into reality. For the first time in weeks, Russia was no longer setting the tempo. It was scrambling to keep up. Western intelligence now broadly agrees on a sobering picture. Moscow's capacity for meaningful military escalation is shrinking even as its rhetoric grows more aggressive. Missile stockpiles are strained. Sanctions are biting deeper into production lines. And the assumption that fear would temper Ukraine's choices and the West's has been exposed as a misread. The strike that was meant to send a warning ended up drawing a firm line. On one side of that line, a Ukraine increasingly able to hit back, backed by accelerated Western support. On the other, a NATO that has reinforced its eastern shield and stripped away the comfort of ambiguity. And in the middle sits the Kremlin, facing a choice it can no longer postpone: push further and risk a confrontation it is poorly positioned to sustain, or step back and accept that the war it once believed it could control has entered a phase where the pace and boundaries are no longer set solely in Moscow. For the first time in this conflict, the pressure isn't all flowing in one direction. The balance has shifted. What comes next will not be met with hesitation, but with preparation. Before you click away, pause and sit with what this moment actually represents. This wasn't just another strike. It was a stress test of limits, of patience, of whether the unwritten rules that have kept a wider European war at bay still function. Seeing that difference between a headline and a hinge point matters more now than at any time since this war began. If this breakdown helped you look past the surface and understand the forces shaping the next moves, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who wants more than slogans and sound bites. And if you want clear, fact-driven explanations of the kind of events that can quietly tip the world in a new direction, consider subscribing, because from here on, the story isn't going to slow down and context will be your best defense.